For my oral report, I decided to do media and influence. I was able to interview three different individuals, each of them from different um, decades, meaning they were born in different decades. The age ranges, are from 51 years old to 81 years old. Um, the very first person that I interviewed is named Rochelle Lewis. She's a 51-year-old wonderful woman who currently works for the state of California, and she's been with the state for about 15 or so years. Miss Rochelle shared that growing up, she did have a record player in the home. She couldn't remember the name of the brand, but she remembered it was white. It was in the shape of a T, and it had really big speakers on either side of it. She had very fond memories of listening to the record player growing up, um, singing and dancing with her mom and her brother, and sometimes her grandmother would come in. Um, she did mention that there were some records or artists that they couldn't listen to. The Ohio Players was one. Um, Honey was another one. And the reasons were some of them had, lewd, in compared to back in that time, lewd lyrics, and even like the album covers or the record covers. One of them had like a syringe, insinuating drug use. So her mother would hide those records. They would find them from time to time, but her mother would hide them. Um, in regards to radio, Miss Rochelle did express that they listen to radio. She is from San Bernardino, grew up in San Bernardino, um, and she was saying at that time there was only really one radio station that they could get that would play the music she grew up listening to and that her family was into, which was R&B and a little bit of like soul, and that radio station was 99.1. Other stations, she said, was very hard to get on the radio. And some of her fondest memories involve her being in the backseat of her mother's car with her brother with the radio turned all the way up, singing and dancing in the back seat. As we moved on to talk about television, it was very interesting to get Miss Rochelle's take on um, television compared to her young life, compared to her adult life, meaning currently. So growing up, she did watch TV. There was a TV already in the home when she was born. Um, it was color TV. It was in the living room. They would watch TV together as a family. TV time was limited. They had about an hour, sometimes 2 hours, that they could watch television, and then it went off. And about 95% of the time when the TV was on, it was a family event. And I saw that kind of across the board, a little bit different with our last interviewee, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Um, and the reason it's interesting compared to Miss Rochelle now and what she does now is that when her kids were born, she has two kids. She has a son, 31, and a daughter, 23, going on 24. When they were kids, she did not have a television in the house at all. Her son was 13 and her daughter was 5. They were 13 and 5 when she purchased the first television for their house. She expressed that she did not believe in having the TV in the house. She thought that compared to when she was growing up, television had become more violent, and she felt that it could potentially dumb down the children, and she didn't want that. So they got their first television at about, her daughter was 5, son was 13, and even to this day, she says they don't have a major interest in television. They'll watch it if it's on, but they don't, meaning her children, don't look forward to sitting down and consuming a bunch of TV, which is good and interesting. In regards to movies, um, Miss Rochelle enjoyed movies growing up, but they didn't have an opportunity to go to many movies. Her mother was a single mom, and so movies cost money. That was extra money that they didn't necessarily have to spend at the time. But when they did get a chance to go, they mainly went to the drive-in theater because it was a little cheaper, and it was fun. They enjoyed doing that. As she got older, I'm talking like teenage years, she was able to go a little bit more often, and she could go with friends. A couple of movies that she could remember that stood out to her were Purple Rain, Star Wars, um, Back to the Future. So those were a couple of movies that stood out to her. She said growing up, movies weren't that important to her, but now as an adult, movies are important to her. She very much enjoys watching movies, and she enjoys what technology has brought in regards to streaming platforms, Netflix, Hulu, HBO Now. So she enjoys being able to consume movies from the comfort of her own home. I want to jump back very, very quickly to radio and television, especially in regards to commercials and advertisement. In regards to the radio, Miss Rochelle remembered a lot of cigarette commercials, and she felt that that was because her mother smoked at the time. And in regards to television, she remembered a lot of commercials being targeted to women and stay-at-home moms. So whenever commercials came on, especially like during the daytime, she remembers them being very much geared towards women. She said some women in the commercials would even have on aprons, and they would be displaying the new vacuum, or doing their Vanna White to the new refrigerator or microwave even. And so I found that to be pretty interesting. Moving on to my second interviewee, her name was Miss Sylvia Angel, and she works for Riverside Workforce Services. She's been in local government for a little over 25 years. She has two sons, one of them 31, 32, and the other one about 28, 27. She grew up in the Riverside and Corona area. She lives in the Corona area currently. And she very fondly remembers growing up listening to records. They had an LP Pioneer, and they would listen to it in the family room. She's the youngest of many siblings, mostly boys and a couple of girls, and then her as the baby. So she was born, music was there. She grew up listening to records. She was introduced to many different genres, from rock and roll, Motown, soul, R&B. Marvin Gaye is an artist who comes to mind. Michael Jackson is an artist. Deep Purple, Led Zeppelin. She mentioned a few others as well. Many Motown artists. They weren't told in her household that they couldn't listen to specific records. They just knew instinctively not to listen to certain songs when their parents were around, so that's what they did. She did not remember like how much a record cost or anything like that because they were already there. They were always around her, especially having as many siblings as she had. In regards to the radio, it was a communal thing. It was something that the different kids in the community would come together and they would listen to the radio. They would even call in to some radio stations to participate in contests. Most of the stations they listened to were like top 40 pop chart type of radio stations. Miss Sylvia Angel could not remember any specific radio commercials. She did state that getting AM radio stations was very difficult back then. It was very hard to dial in an AM radio station is what she stated. But comparing her experience with radio to that of her children's, she made sure that her children were exposed to just about every musical genre that she could expose them to. Music is very important to her life. She has a lot of deep founded memories in regards to and in relation to music. It was a very a family-oriented event to listen to music and sing and dance and be together. So she provided that to her children. Um, I failed to mention that Miss Sylvia is in her late 50s, entering her 60s. Um, Moving on to television, um, she was born in a household that did have a TV. They would watch it together. One thing that she stated is that her brothers did kind of dictate what they watched. So they watched shows like The Rifleman, Bonanza, um, and then Saturday morning cartoons. She did get to watch other like wholesome, like family sitcom type shows, but her brothers did kind of dictate what they watched most often. Um, in regards to commercials, the ones that stuck out to her were like Coca-Cola commercials, 7-Up commercials, commercials that had like a jingle or a little ditty to them. She remembered them, and a few of them she remembered just about word for word, and it had been 20 plus years since she may have seen one of those commercials. The power of advertising is real. Um, in regards to movies, Miss Sylvia Angel is an avid movie goer. Growing up, they would go to Saturday morning matinees or Saturday early, between 10 and 12 matinees. And she was saying back then, before the feature, there would be double features, meaning two movies back to back. There would be a break, and then they would play the second film. So before the films would start, they would give a platform to local artists, or they could come up and do a very brief show or put on or display some type of talent, meaning live individuals would come up on stage and share their talent, and then people would get popcorn and they would come back for the double feature. As Miss Sylvia Angel grew up, her and her friends would start to go to movies in their early teens and late teens into their 20s. Star Wars was big. I found that interesting that both Miss Sylvia Angel and Miss Rochelle Lewis mentioned Star Wars. Just proves how big and impactful Star Wars was. She also mentioned Flashdance. She mentioned Saturday Night Fever. So those were a couple of movies that stood out to her. It was interesting that she mentioned movies along with music. So movies coupled with good music, or music that she grew up with as a younger child, had a deep impact on her emotionally. Films that could blend music together well had a stronger emotional impact on her. And so she mentioned those things. She also mentioned that now with streaming services and the way that cinematography has drastically improved, a lot of these streaming platforms produce films that rival that of traditional cinema. And so she compared how she consumes movies now to how she did when she was growing up, and how it's a lot easier to access film. You have Redbox, of course we know Netflix, and Hulu, and a lot of movies, they'll come out in January and be available on streaming platforms by sometimes March, sometimes even the next month. So those were some differences that she compared from when she was a child to now. My final interviewee is a very special person to me. He is my father, James Deuce Sr. He is 81 years old. Yes, I said that right. 81 years old, military veteran, served a total of 24 years in the military, and he went on to preach for about 20 years or so. And he retired, and he's been relaxing ever since. He was born in 1938. So he was born and World War II happened, and so he did say that he grew up with a record player in the house. He was interested in jazz, Western music, doo-wop, doo-wop and soul, gospel and soul music. Um, he remembers Benny Goodman, Gene Autry, Louis Armstrong, Frank Sinatra. Um, he remembers artists like that, Smokey Robinson, the Midnighters. Those are some artists that he remembered. Um, he did say, I'm moving on now to radio, that the family did have a radio. He said they weren't something that were extremely difficult to get, but they did cost money. Like families did have to save up to buy radios, and there were two models that you could buy. One that had a very large battery that would last a couple of months, and then another model where you had to buy 6 to 8 batteries, and it would last about a month or a little bit more than a month. He said that the radio would play for like 3 or 4 hours, and then it would turn off. It would be staticky. So I found that to be interesting, very interesting actually. There were commercials on the radio, he said, and a lot of them, most of them had jingles or little ditties to them, is what he called them, jingles or a ditty. One of them was about toothpaste and brushing your teeth, and he sang the jingle for me, which was wild because that was 70 years ago, and he could remember that jingle word for word. So it proves that, you know, advertisers and marketers know what they're doing. They know what they're doing, so that was interesting. No one had a television in their home at that time. There was one TV at the community center, and it was black and white. It was black and white, and so television played from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. If there was a special program, sometimes it would go to 9 p.m., but then that was it. If the TV would be on, there would be nothing on the TV. It would just be static, which is crazy to think about, but that's what it was. He said TV greatly impacted society and his community because it gave actual moving pictures to the things people were hearing about or reading about in the paper or hearing on the radio. He was a little guy, but World War II was going on, and you could see, you know, the blurry images of men running across the screen, or you could see war dogs, and you could hear commentary, and it was very impactful to his community. And it was something that carried with him. Like he said, it was a societal change. It was a cultural change, TV. And over the years, as he got older, he just saw how more engrossed television became a part of everyday life. Whereas, you know, when he was young, there was only one TV that he knew of, and it was a shared television with the entire community, not in one household. In regards to movies and film, my father loved Western movies growing up as a young man. As a kid and a teenager, he loved Western movies. The first movie he ever saw was it was called A Dog Named Lucky. And it was about a dog who had been in the war and had come home, and they were trying to domesticate the dog, and he had a lot of wildness in him left from the war. And so as he grew older, those films, Western films, kind of stuck with him, and he still loves Westerns to this day. The biggest difference that my father mentioned about movie going back then, when he was growing up, to now, is that when he was growing up, all movie theaters in the South were segregated. So whites and blacks were separate. White moviegoers would sit down on the ground floor, and if blacks were allowed to be in there, when whites were in there, they had to sit in the balcony. They were not always allowed to be in the movie theater when white moviegoers were in there. Sometimes, you know, they would have to watch the movie first, and then blacks or African Americans could come in and watch the movie later. So for my father, that was the greatest difference between movie going then and now. He can remember when desegregation happened and when he first went back to the South and he got to go to a movie theater that was desegregated, and it had a very lasting impact on him. I had an amazing time interviewing these three interviewees. It was very impactful and insightful to see their thoughts and what memories they had. and how they consumed media over the decades, and especially compared to how they consume media now and how they feel about consuming the various different mediums that we have. So thank you for watching, and God bless.